So, let's talk Pyro in New Vegas, because this has been a contentious topic in my comments. I put out a thing saying, like, I have no idea what faction this guy would choose, but now, like, the comments seem to agree with me because I had, like, several different responses. But it's not like with Soldier, where it was, oh, I think he'd be NCR, or I think he'd be Enclave, or even, a lot of people said they think he'd be part of the Boomers. Which is a strange one, considering A, he's already a boomer, because he's old, but also you can't finish the game with the boomers, what is this? Now, the reason thoughts about Pyro are so all over the place is because he's not like the other characters, he's not very, like, easy to define, because despite, you know, the TF2 comics filling in extra personalities and all the extra material, Pyro is always one of those people where his actual personality is really hard to define, because when Pyro's on the enemy team, he comes across quite menacing, whereas when he's on your team, he comes across quite cute and wholesome. Like, the best example for this, I think, is the Meet the Pyro video, where, obviously, in the reality, he's, like, murdering the red team. But in Pyro's little fantasy world, he's this cute little guy running around with the cherubs, feeding them all candy, and that's kind of how he is on your team, because he puts out your fires and saves you from spies. And it really makes it difficult to nail down who I think Pyro would side with, because we don't get a lot of space inside his own head that's coherent. Like, Pyro doesn't seem like the sort who would definitely pick a side. You have to sort of almost make up what he'd do based upon the Pyro vision, which is an interesting idea, but I don't think it lends to a very fulfilling character arc. So to get around this, I'm basically going to go over a handful of different outcomes I think Pyro could go with. Similar to the Soldier, like, NCR versus Enclave video, I think discussing a handful of scenarios I think would be more interesting. And essentially we can just pick whichever one we think is the most interesting and go with that. I'll start with the least interesting ones and work up to the ones I think are more interesting. So one I saw a handful of times, which I thought was really peculiar, was people think he'd side with Elijah from Dead Money. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of Dead Money, as you guys know, but I don't really think it would suit Pyro in any way to want to do this with Elijah, because it just seems like he wouldn't necessarily have a reason to. Because let's go over Pyro's personality quick. Like, he doesn't seem to be malicious, but I described him in the original video as he's very practically skilled, but he's also quite innocent at the same time from a lot of what we've seen. Because it's not like Pyro enjoys hurting people in any way, Pyro just naively believes what he's doing is actually helping them, which is really fucking ominous when you think about it, but that kind of means you'd need to rationalize why he would side with Elijah. Like, because this is the issue with Pyro vision as a concept. You imagine he's saying, like, in his vision, like, Elijah goes, Pyro, you must come and help me spread the candy over the USA. Like, you gotta believe Pyro thinks that maybe this red cloud is something that's gonna help people, but then how does Elijah see that? Like, does Pyro go, yes, I will help spread the candy, and Elijah goes, what the fuck, I want to kill the NCR, cause funny. But I think if we start to consider what the DLC outcomes would be, I think things are gonna get a bit weird. Cause, like, I can't imagine Scout going in there and clicking anything besides the one that locks him in there, or trying to grab all the gold bars at once and dying like that. So this adds an entire extra dimension to the classes, so maybe you could rationalize somehow that he'd maybe side with Elijah, but I think, you know, I can't see it really working out. Because this is another issue with, like, trying to rationalize who Pyro would side with. There's no real deep character motivation going on. Pyro just kind of does what Pyro wishes. It's the issue with a lot of the other classes. I like analyzing what each of the other classes would do, because every TF2 class has a very defined personality. I can give solid rationalization, and a lot of people in the comments also give good reasoning as to why each character would side with who, and we can get a little bit of a debate going, but that's because these characters, you know, what they would do is so distinct because they're so memorable. But Pyro is massively debatable because there is no set definition for what happens in Pyroland. You could basically have Pyro see whatever you wanted to get whatever outcome going you needed to. So if you wanted to say, I don't know, like, Pyro sees Super Mutant Behemoth as like a giant gummy bear that he's got to spray with sparkles, you could do that. Now I'm just thinking of an entire parody comic series where Pyro just sees the NCR and the Legion as, like, gummy bears and gingerbread men that fight them, like, over the big gingerbread house that is the dam, essentially, that stops the syrup from flowing away or something. That would be pretty funny. But it makes you wonder how Pyro sees death in Pyrovision, because one of the other suggestions I got that was Pyro would be part of the Fiends, which is a whole other kettle of fish, because it's like, well, how would Pyro perceive all this murder and other awful things the Fiends get up to? Because I got a few comments saying he would be really good friends with Cook. Now, I get it, they both wear masks, full body suits, and like fire. However, I'd hope Pyro wouldn't be very, you know, pleased by Cook's, struggle cuddling, so to speak. I really don't want to picture the alternate universe where they're best friends and Pyro's just watching Cook wrestle people. You know, it's just a little bit uncomfortable. I don't like it very much. Crimes against nature aside, I don't really like the idea that Pyro would be some sort of raider, because I think Pyro's quite a cutie. I think he's quite an innocent, good-natured boy, and I don't like the idea of using Pyrovision as an excuse to, like, make him go on a murder spree for, like, no reason. But then again, in the TF2 universe, he is a paid mercenary who is paid to murder people, so what do I know? I'm probably just projecting. I don't really want to think my favorite mumbly boy is a bad person, but you know what? I think the canon will go against me on this one, so I'm not going to die on this hill. So side note, people in the comments were saying if Pyro was in Fallout 4, he'd totally be part of the Forged, and well yeah, it's like he's purpose-built for the Forged, because their whole thing is fire and metal, so we do a great job over there. I can just imagine Pyro covering the Commonwealth in Forge-themed settlements. But I could see that working a lot better, because despite Pyrovision, Pyro still seems to have this strange affinity for fire, where if he saw these raiders and their whole thing is we like fire, fire's great, we worship the fire, that would basically be his little cult. I would be surprised he just becomes the leader of these guys, being like, yeah, we like the fire, we're cool. But Fallout 4 is a lot harder to assign, like, character motivation for, considering the factions are not as good in Fallout 4, because in Fallout New Vegas, they're all very all-encompassing, whereas in 4, they're very niche, and it's kind of hard to... Like, if I was told to do a series where, oh, which side would the TF2 mercs take in Fallout 4, that would be infinitely harder, because you'd have to justify them. It's like, for example, the Railroad. Like, they might be about sneaky stuff and, like, espionage and all that, but I can't see Spy wanting to side with them, for example, even though sneaky and espionage is, like, kind of his thing, because I don't think he'd really give much of a shit about freeing the synths, you know? It's part of the bigger problem with Fallout 4, where it's like, okay, so if the mercs are in there, are they Nate? Do they have the sun? I can't imagine Scout procreating. Ew. Getting back to New Vegas, I think these next three options are very similar. I've seen this common idea in the comments basically saying Pyro just likes to be told what to do. And I could believe that because, you know, he works for, well, he has a job, but it's not really a strong argument there, is it? A lot of people in the comments said Pyro just enjoys being told what to do. He's not particularly political minded, he just likes to be given a task and to achieve that task. For example, you know, he works for Manco, they tell him what to do, and whenever Miss Pauling gives him quests and the contract system, her voice lines are always very, almost condescending, like he's a child. She's like, hey buddy, you wanna do this? I've got a job for you, go do this thing. So by this logic, people think he would side with Mr. House because Mr. House is basically the most boss-like of all the characters in terms of traditional employment, because obviously, you know, Caesar's literally a dictator, but that's a whole other thing. So I heard the argument quite a lot that because Pyro is quite the jobby, he would just sort of do whatever Mr. House says because he's the closest thing Pyro could have for a boss. I'm not entirely thrilled with this line of logic, but considering Pyro seems to like being told what to do, I guess it makes sense. However, I think this would factor a lot more into sort of Yes Man's line of logic, because I think Yes Man would almost sort of rizz up Pyro to an extent. Pyro likes being told what to do, and I don't think Pyro would put up any significant resistance to Yes Man, because Yes Man's used to being like, oh yeah, you know, I can sort of like give you the advice and I'll tell you whatever you want. But Yes Man very clearly has his own sort of opinions and points of view underneath all the Securitron programming. So I think Yes Man will recognize, hey, this guy just kind of does what I tell him is a good idea. So I guess I could lie by omission and just not tell him the thing he doesn't want to hear, and Yes Man could sort of manipulate Pyro that way. But another reason I think he'd side Yes Man is because, well, everyone in the comments kept bringing up this one part from the comics where Pyro becomes the CEO of a company called Frontier Engineering somehow after losing his job to the to Greyman in the comics. So there's a couple different ways you could take this. You could take this either Yes Man sort of like almost manipulates Pyro, but at the same time, there's no reason to suggest Pyro isn't enterprising, because I made the point that Pyro is not particularly a leader, but everyone was like, oh, Pyro does sort of like become the CEO of that company. So you could argue that Pyro just, you know, as much as he's Mr. I'm fire, I like to burn things, you could argue maybe Pyro likes to build as well, he's not just a destructive monster. Despite Pyro's seeming appearance, Pyro isn't actually the sort of person who just wants to watch the world burn, ironically enough. I think Pyro does like doing things, so it's not like he's the sort of person who's like, I want the world to be burned to cinders, which is another reason I can't get behind the whole Raider idea, because it doesn't really seem like it's the sort of thing he does when given the opportunity to actually get something done and productive created. Although in saying that, Pyro does basically give up everything the second he sees Miss Pauling and soldiers start a fire on one of the rooftops, so maybe Pyro will, just if given the opportunity, just break things, and maybe I'm trying to, again, once like attribute positive features to Pyro that just aren't there. And on that line of logic, people mentioned that Pyro likes being told what to do. Something someone else said, well, a handful of people said, is that Pyro would just go with the first person who would tell them to do anything. And by that logic, I feel like he'd actually be a Caesar's Legion person. And although that's crazy, let me explain. So I think the first major faction Pyro would run into that would ask him to do anything of value would be Caesar's Legion in Nipton. You know, I'm gonna make the same old classic joke, but like, I think Pyrovision would kick in, and I think he'd see Vulpes as an actual foxman. So you imagine in Pyrovision, he walks into this town, everyone's tied up on little spikes, and I guess Pyro sees them as little fairies dancing around or something. There's a lovely furry man in the middle who looks very cute and ooh nuzzle wuzzles, and they're surrounded by fire. Pyro's having a great time. He's just hit the epic furry party he's always wanted to be part of, because, you know, they do say pyromanes are all furries. So he'd fit in perfectly. And if you think about it, the Legion don't really do anything to you unless you get in their way. So realistically, Pyro would have no reason to go against the Legion at that point. So I think Pyro would continue with the house route. He'd get up to the point where he's got to go to the fort to chase down Benny. Caesar would give him the platinum chip, tell him to destroy the bunker. Mr. House would say, don't destroy the bunker, reactivate the Securitrons, and Pyro would do that because he does what he's told. Then Mr. House tells him to come back to the Lucky 38, but Caesar wants to see him first, so I'm pretty sure once Caesar tells Pyro to kill Mr. House, Pyro would just do that. And now, you know, one of the two people giving him orders is gone. So logically, he's going to go back to Caesar and be like, well, I did it, now what? So then I think at that point, he's just stuck serving Caesar. And I like to think he'd do this because he'd just be naively following orders, like, yeah, you know, I do what I want. I like to think he'd essentially be like a little wild card where if someone tells Pyro to do something, he just does it. But the second he's given a different option, he'll just do it without thinking. He's like, oh, I just follow orders. I don't use my thinking sponge at all. Ironically, this way, I think we'd end up with one of the better Legion endings where Pyro would actually manage to save Caesar from dying from the brain tumor because he'd go to the vault and find this autodock, and Pyro would just go, okay, do it, and then Caesar would survive that way. So honestly, this is one of the better routes for Caesar. If Pyro just survives, it is okay. And then the entire Mojave is enslaved just because Pyro likes following orders. Isn't he precious? Member shoutouts. Thank you to Brandon Ferretti, Irrational Sloth, Gams, Tucket Flame, Johannes, Throne One, Gamra, Commie the Cockroach, Jacqueline, The Man Who Sold the World, Stephen the King, Makov, Vinite, Wilkins Coffee, and Toilet Egg McMuffin.